It's my privilege and pleasure to introduce our guest. Ivan Day is an independent historian of gastronomy and dining culture, professional chef and confectioner, writer, collector of old recipes, a leading expert on European and especially British cuisine. Ivan Day came to the Czech Republic on the occasion of the conference called Food Journeys, Cesty jídla, and was kind to give us his time for an interview. Hello, Mr.
Hello, great to be here.
Contemporary society is used to a cuisine as a reality show that sees, for example, Gordon Ramsay travel the continents, tasting food all over the world. We watch all the master classes or high-performance kitchen, food attacks, etc. How does one present the cuisine of the early modern period to such a society?
You can do it in a very similar dramatic way because food is multi-pronged. You have the food of the elites, the emperor, the king, the monarchy, then of the merchant class, and then of ordinary people. And of course, the biggest group are the ordinary people. And back in the early modern period, some of those people actually produced the food for the people at the top. The king couldn't boil an egg. He had somebody to do it for him. And these professional cooks, like Gordon Ramsay, they had to produce perfect dishes, often very stylized. Maybe the king is getting married to a beautiful Italian princess, and he'll know all about her food culture because the food at the top was international. Mm-hmm. You know, here in the Habsburg lands, it wasn't that different from it as it was in the top in England, in the royal palace, or in France. They intermarried and they learnt their food culture. But what's interesting is the people, the servants who cooked, came from the Aboriginal ordinary people of each country, mm-hmm. and they had to learn how to do it. And if you tell people now that the working people who made the food were really the creative ones, as I said, the king never cooked, mm-hmm. but he expected a certain quality, mm-hmm. and it had to be international, often very artistic, and good to eat. You realize that there's two ends of this. Mm-hmm. There's the ordinary guys at one end who are the professionals, and at the top you have the people who are actually consuming it. Mm-hmm. And of course, there are many influences throughout time. So at the beginning of the early modern period, we're coming out of what most people call the Middle Ages, the medieval period, where the main thrust in food has actually come from the Middle East. Mm-hmm. There was a huge influence of the Islamic world on food, mainly because a lot of noblemen in the early medieval period had to go to the Holy Land to the Crusades. And they lived there for years. They went native. They absorbed the flavors and ingredients which they couldn't grow in Northern Europe. Mm-hmm. So when they returned, they wanted some of those things. So you get things like rose water distilled in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. You get dried fruits like raisins and, citrus fruits particularly. Mm-hmm. Cedri, citrons and lemons, oranges. They start to become an important part of the nobleman's food in Europe. And the type of food that is favored at court is really a kind of sweet sour. We're using dried fruits, we're using certain souring agents like citrus juice, sour grape juice, verjuice was a really important, but it's always got sugar or something sweet. So it's a bit like some Chinese dishes where you have sweet sour chicken, and you still get that in North Africa. You go to North Africa and you might have a lamb that's roasted with apricots, and that was the general style of food was like that. And of course that was favored in all the European courts really between 1200 and even until the 1600s. And of course it slowly changes, mainly because of one particular country, and of course it's France. At the French court, things started to change. They moved away from sweet and sour, and they favored the savory flavors of things like mushrooms. They made concentrated meat concentrates called coulis, which lifted the flavor up. And the French started to laugh at cultures like the British and the Germans, who were still favoring this ancient medieval style. And they moved on. And then, of course, by the time you get into the 18th century, every nobleman in the whole of Europe wants French food. And they start getting ashamed of the national foods. Like here in the Habsburg lands, a lot of people who lived in palaces like this, they might favor French food. And they don't want the normal food. They associate it with ordinary people, with the peasantry, with merchants. It's a huge story. It's a massive story. How we make people in the 21st century aware of the story could be multi-pronged. I mean, I've tried to get people in television interested in doing, serious documentaries on it because it's such a good subject, and it's also very colorful, lots of great stories, often very amusing, and also visually really dramatic, because if you're dealing with aristocratic food, it's often very beautiful to look at. The appearance of the food is everything. And of course, they lived in a visual world which is much more refined than the one that we live in our small city flats and apartments, So often the food has an aesthetic which reflects the room you're eating it in, So for instance, there's an object here that might interest you. Yeah, this is an 18th century wood mold that was used by a confectioner for ornamenting sweet foods. And it has got these Baroque motifs. This one is, it's an 18th century, so probably about 1760. And this one actually is a symbol that is associated with Louis XVI. It's a symbol of love. It's got two lovebirds, two doves, kissing each other, Cupid's arrows in a sheath, and then the flame, the eternal flame, in a torch of love, And you will see this kind of design, on an architectural motif or embroidered into a piece of costume or in a painting or in a piece of sculpture, maybe gilded on a staircase.
So it was all connected.
But it starts to come on the food. So the aesthetics of what food looked like often reflects the noble environment around you, So we start to get illustrations of what some of these foods look like from the medieval period onwards. You can see there might be a painting of the Last Supper with Christ and the apostles. And when you look at the table, and I spend all my time looking at the table in a painting, you'll see things. That tends to be ordinary food, bread and fish maybe, But if it's something like Lazarus and Dives, where you have a prince who is rejecting a poor man, the prince is often shown on his table in his palace, eating wonderful things. And sometimes you see what's on the table, and it's possible to use that as a model. It might be a pastry, but what's really interesting, and it refers to this culture here, is one of the most interesting sources for me is a book that was published quite late in 1719, but it was a book written by the master cook to the Archbishop of Salzburg. So it's in the Habsburg lands. And he was very old when he wrote it, so his working life would have been in the previous century, in the 17th century, very Baroque, and it is the most extraordinary Baroque cookery book because it has more than 300 engravings of food, of the kind he made. A lot of it is pastry, confectionery, there are savory dishes, but everything is ornamented, with extraordinary skill. And it's unique. There's nothing like this in France. There's nothing like it in other German-speaking areas. It was published in Augsburg, but he was Swiss actually. It shows it was international. Published in Augsburg, but he worked in Salzburg all of his life. He was a military cook at one point. So he cooked for the soldiers, but he cooked for the archbishop, was almost as high as the emperor, very elevated. So they're my sources. I have an original copy of this very rare book. It's that thick. It's absolutely extraordinary. So thinking about this region as it was, you think now it's a republic, the Czech Republic, but it was part of a bigger world. First of all, Christendom, and then the Habsburg lands, and it's the best windows really are the literature. This is the equipment that the cook used. There's another one, for instance. This allows you to make a crown out of sugar, a royal crown. You make this in sugar, and you can assemble it as a three-dimensional. And it was used to ornament certain foods, on top, to make it relevant for a really noble boss. But these are the things that are really important. This is specific to one luxury food that was enjoyed mainly by the nobility in the 18th century, which is ice cream. Now it's been democratized. Everybody eats it on the street out of a cone. During this period, you might have ice cream served here, maybe in this Sala Terrena. In the height of the summer, a servant would come down with a tray and you'd have it, and the ice had to come from some hole in the ground where it had been stored. It was very expensive to make. You would have eaten it off perfect porcelain cups, served in a beautiful porcelain piece of equipment to keep it cold, So this book, it's French, but it was written really for noble households or the servants, these ordinary working people, and it was a new kind of food that had arrived in the late 17th century from Italy. And here is a book, and you can see here, you're in a similar environment to this palais. You've got noble buildings here, almost again like a loggia or something like that. And these little putties, they are making ice cream with the equipment that was used at the time. And then they're not serving the nobility. This one here has got a little salver and little glass cups, and he's just about to set up with, like this one, to feed the gods with ice cream, And of course, this was, in the main, an aristocratic, very expensive food, the height of luxury at the time. And we think, well, it must have been maybe a bit crunchy, primitive, No, it wasn't. What we forget is ice cream was invented by we don't know who. It just starts to come. And so we'd assume it couldn't have been very nice. It couldn't have been like, we got electrical freezers. They had nothing. How did they make it? It must have been primitive. Well, they discovered it. We inherited it from them. And actually, if you read this book, you realize it has got over 100 recipes.
Really?
Yeah. For flavors you will not get in any Italian gelateria in Prague or Rome or London or anywhere, New York even. And it has got, for instance, one very fashionable 18th century ingredient, ananas, which is pineapple, of course, and it says here the king of fruit, King of fruit. King of fruit. And they made, that was one flavor that was really popular. And of course, many of the gardeners employed in these noble households were growing them at this period. Even here, they grew them under glass, but, and another one is the cedro, which is this big, like a giant lemon, a citron, we call it, But, when you look at the index of this wonderful book, you have a list of all the different flavors, you know, and it's quite extraordinary how many there are. You know, these are just mousse, frozen mousse, you know, and you realize, I mean, it's French, but they didn't lead the way. Italy, the Italians were leading the way with this. In the Kingdom of Naples, particularly, also in Sicily, and the Spanish to a degree as well. You know, so it was a Mediterranean thing. They wanted cool drinks and cool things in the summer because it's a very hot summer. So Naples, particularly, which is very hot, became the epicenter. And you think, how did they do it? Where did they get the ice from? They got it from the mountain. You know, in the winter, they stored it in a cave, and then they gradually understood how to make this to a very precise method. I've made, out of the 120 ices in this book, I probably made about 60 of them, half of them, and they're all absolutely superb. Smooth, wonderful, you know.
Tasty?
Very tasty too, delicious. Some of them are better than modern ices, you know. I've just led a class actually a few days ago with a group of people here, and we had people mainly from the Czech Republic, but some from France and Germany came as well. They came all the way, and they were really, really surprised at how good it was.
Yeah,
the big mistake, I think, a lot of people, they make the assumption that, you know, it must have been primitive, rustic, you know. But of course we're talking about the nobility and their very expensive taste, and also their very aesthetic taste, and also the frivolity of their taste. Like, this is a mold to make sugar shells. This is a coquille, you know, and this is I don't know what it would call it in Czech, in Italiano, vongole. It's not an oyster, but it's a clam, vongole we call it. So if you make two of those, you can put them together, and it looks just like a real seashell. You can't tell the difference. But the purpose was, it was given to the ladies at the end of the dinner, and they would put a gift inside it, you know. It might be a diamond ring, it might be a tiny bottle of perfume, it might be some message on a bit of paper, you know, I love you, this kind of thing, you know. And the same with this. They're made for little, and they did the same with walnuts, you know. So often by the side of your plate would be this little gift. And sometimes pieces of sculpture as well, sometimes made out of sugar, sometimes on the middle of the table you might get very large pieces of sculpture. And of course, we all think, oh, it was decorative. No, a lot of it was not, it was symbolic. If we go further back in time to the late medieval, early Renaissance period, you hear about these extraordinary pieces of sculpture made of food. You know, they can be made from sugar, from almond paste, marzipane, or pastry, and they are rather like a piece of sculpture that we're looking across the courtyard. Is it Hercule or somebody there? You know, a Titan or whatever, and he's one in the middle of the table. But often they were only made for really important occasions, and there was symbolism. You know, it might be a marriage between two houses, and they want to set the scene by having some. If we go to Italy in the 1470s, there is an incredible survival. It's in the Vatican Library, and it's from the city of Pesaro in northern Italy. There's a family called the Sforza family, and one of the Sforza men marries a woman who was originally Spanish. She's from Aragon in Spain. And it's a big wedding. Unfortunately, a record of it, an illustrated account of the whole wedding has survived. And it's beautifully illustrated. And they have a feast which lasts the whole day into the night. And there are, I think, something like 12 different courses of food. And the 6 courses, which are by daylight, There is a man dressed as the sun. You know, he has a costume, and he is the boss in the dining area. And there are other people for each course who come out in other costume. And because it's the Renaissance, a lot of the characters are based on classical antiquity. So, for instance, there is a sugar sculpture of Mount Helicon, you know, with Apollo playing a musical instrument, made of sugar on it. But it's carried by 3 real women. One is dressed as astronomy, one as grammar, one as rhetoric, you know. So the kind of key figures of learning are there, and they carry it through the hall. Another man is dressed in an incredible costume, and he has silver and gold coins embroidered to it. And on his shoulder, he carries a bucket, a seau, a pail, you know, made of sugar. And in it, there are hundreds of coins made of gold or silver, but they're made of sugar, and they've been gilded. On one side of the coin is the face of the bride, on the other of the groom. And this man, who's called the Influence of Fortune, walks through the dining hall where people are eating their food, and he throws these coins to the people, you know. But in the middle of the coins, curled up, is a sugar snake, you know, because the influence of fortune can be evil as well as good, you know. So, and this is a meal. There are pastry, little pies, and when the guests, they're told to take the lid off, a live bird flies out, you know. It's that kind of theatre. So these people, they lived at a level where they didn't have Netflix, you know, they didn't have a mobile phone, you know. It was a kind of theatre of the table, and of course they could afford it. And the more powerful you were, the more glorious and amazing these performances were. But as I said before, the people who devised these were the ordinary servants who worked for them, really. It was like looking at this wonderful palace, and whoever lived here didn't know how to design an architectural scheme, didn't know how to carve a piece of stone even into just a block to build it with. That was all done by artisan class, really. So we tend to think, well, this food that was cooked for the nobility, well, it was, you know, but it was a creation of ordinary people. And my way in is to try and explain that to people. You know, okay, you know, it's elite, but the people who made it were the people. It's a testament to them. You know, as well as the people who ate it. It's a very long question a long answer to a question.
It's great. You know? You touch many objects.
Sure. Yeah.
You focus on early modern period. It represents 300 years.
Yeah.
So it's a very long period.
It is, yeah.
You are therefore concentrating on a very wide period of European dining.
Yeah.
And how did society's view of gastronomy and dining change during this period? You already touched it in your way, but what are the biggest differences that can be seen during this time?
Yeah, I think the most influential factor of change came from Versailles, from the court of Louis XIV, really, because there was a change in methodology in the kitchen, and also in taste, in sensibility at that time. And at first it was just really in France, at a very noble level, that you had this. Then other people thought that this food is different. They associate it with the most powerful king in Europe, and they want it too. And suddenly it happens really in the middle of the 17th century. But what's interesting about France at that time is, I don't think there's a single cookery book published between about 1590 and 1653. There's nothing, not a single book. So we don't know very much about what was happening, but we do know in 1653 suddenly there's a series of books that come out, and they're describing a type of cookery which is new, which is really new. And it fundamentally is based on a kind of modular system. You know, the cook basically is using ingredients which might be equivalent to the colors that an artist might use, you know. And somebody, maybe his assistant, has prepared these things beforehand, and he takes this and adds it, you know. So it's based on a modular way of cooking. It's very rational. And at this period, of course, you've got the Enlightenment is beginning, you know, Pascal is sort of the intellectual kind of leader. And it makes a lot of sense. But it also starts to move away from this earlier type of cuisine I talked about, which is really a medieval and Renaissance with a strong Islamic influence and it focuses very, very much more on the savory, for instance. So, but one of the things that really is important is something which the French called au goût, the high taste, which is the strong flavors, mainly of meat and fish, where, for instance, they have taken something like some pigeons, and they've cooked them very slowly in some bouillon, and they've added a few other ingredients, maybe some herbs. That's really important because spices dominate the earlier type of food, cinnamon, and these start to move out of savory foods. They stay in sweet, but the spices, maybe pepper remains, maybe nutmeg a bit, you know. But medieval food was very spicy, like Islamic and Eastern food. So herbs like thyme and marjoram, rosemary, they were there before, but they become more important in savory foods. And particularly fungi, truffles, morels, other mushrooms. It's those sort of flavors that they want in their savory dishes. So you get the invention of new types of savory foods like ragout, which is quite a strong flavored stew, if you like, you know. You get fricassee, you know, which again often has cream in it. And these classic French ways of dealing with meat and fish start to appear. And the cook becomes like an alchemist, you know, a conjurer who has to try and make these flavors for his noble lord. So they move away from this old-fashioned style